I will simply say that we're happy to see that the groups we've supported continue to be pursuing their goals and actively working to pursue protection of civil liberties and frankly, citizen participation in what Hong Kong's political governance framework should be.
We'll come to that conversation in just a moment. From Seoul, South Korea, you're listening to Asia News Weekly. The vote Hong Kong really needs to take, North Korea's human rights abuses take center stage, and the Sewol captain faces the death penalty. These stories and more are on the October 31st edition of Asia News Weekly. Hello everyone, and welcome to this week's podcast. I'm your host, Steve Miller, and I'd like to thank you for listening and downloading this week's show. 5 weeks. That's the amount of time pro-democracy advocates have been on the streets of Hong Kong, demanding universal suffrage. To be truthful, things are really going nowhere. Neither side is giving any ground, and that is what sorely needs to change, as tensions are running higher than ever before now that we've crossed the 1-month mark. Beijing says it's honoring the handoff agreement by allowing Hong Kongers the choice of electing candidates the central government vets. But that's unacceptable, according to protest organizers who demand open nominations. The High Court has extended injunctions against protest groups at 2 different locations, ordering them to vacate the area. But Occupy members refuse to do so. In a straw poll conducted by Reuters, 87% said they were willing to keep up the campaign for more than a year, and 93% said that even if they were forcibly removed, they would regroup to launch fresh street occupations. The central government and Hong Kong's chief executive, Sewol Leung, assert that outside forces are behind the Occupy Central movement. The National Endowment for Democracy was one such organization that was named. It's a non-governmental organization based out of Washington, D.C. Louisa Grieve, Vice President of Programs for Asia, the Middle East, and North Africa, spoke to Voice of America's Michael Lupin about allegations of interference.
First of all, the American government and American foreign policy is a separate question from what NED does. You know, it's an independent organization. It has a dedicated budget, which is paid for by the American taxpayers, but the decision-making is not part of American foreign policy. Decision-making is based on our dedicated mission of supporting Democrats with their projects that they put forward that they want to work on to advance democracy, human rights, worker rights in their own home society. So, there's no U.S. interference in this case. It's a matter of cooperation among civil society organizations for common goals.
So what is the National Endowment for Democracy doing in Hong Kong?
Well, NED's programs were in line with the objective of ensuring accountability and public attention to preservation of civil liberties. Lots of people in Hong Kong are paying attention to that, so we're happy to be supporting civil society groups that are part of the public debate and having open civic engagement, which itself is a democratic value. So, I will only go so far as to say we haven't done an outside evaluation. I will simply say that we're happy to see that the groups we've supported continue to be pursuing their goals and actively working to pursue protection of civil liberties and frankly, citizen participation in what Hong Kong's political governance framework should be.
Grieve made it perfectly clear her organization's mission is to support democracy and not dictate outcomes. Even though the National Endowment for Democracy has been funding programs for nearly 20 years, it's easy to see how Beijing can paint a picture that the United States and other Western powers are influencing the so-called umbrella revolution. It just makes connecting the dots all too easy. This is why the proposed vote by protest organizers over the previous weekend was so vitally important. It was supposed to take place at 3 different protest camps that have sprung up across the city. The vote would measure how protesters wanted to respond to conciliatory measures offered by the government as a way to end the disruption. The vote would have taken place by mobile phone and have allowed protesters to express their views, as well as to put pressure on the government, according to organizers. More importantly, it would have painted a clear picture of what the people of Hong Kong wanted, and one that couldn't be influenced by, quote, foreign elements. But the vote was called off. There are many differences in opinions on various issues, including on the complexity of the questions asked and the practical use of the poll, organizers said in a released statement. Occupy Central organizer Chan Kin Man said that some felt the poll was too moderate in soliciting views on the government's proposals. During the talks with students, Chief Secretary Carrie Lam had proposed two concessions: that the Hong Kong government submit a report on the Occupy movement to Beijing, and that a multi-party platform be established to discuss the long-term constitutional developments, both of which would not have been implemented before the 2017 election. With the three main protest groups split on how best to proceed, it spells trouble for their movement. They're fighting for democracy, something that is very noble and worthwhile, but they're doing so against Beijing. It's a government that has the time and resources to simply wait and wear them out. Hong Kong officials repeatedly have said that changes must occur within the system, within the framework of the Basic Law. The split focus is also giving much-needed time to blue ribbon or pro-Beijing factions to gather up support in an attempt to return the city to the way it once was. What the protesters must do at this stage is simply not just demand universal suffrage, they must develop a concrete plan to achieve it. That is exactly what needs to be put forward. It needs to be said at every opportunity and at every speaking engagement. It needs to be their new rallying cry. They have the option for open dialogue, but if they can't organize themselves, they won't be able to organize a democracy, and their movement will fail. What are your thoughts on the Umbrella Revolution's direction? What needs to happen next? Later in the podcast, South Korea's prosecution asks for the death penalty for the Sewol captain. North Korea is never one to stay too far out of the press. Since our last podcast, the regime has continued to make headlines on a number of different fronts. A draft resolution prepared for the Third Committee by the European Union and Japan urged the General Assembly to send the regime to the International Criminal Court in The Hague to stand trial for crimes against humanity. It's the first time a measure this strong has ever been requested. Quote, "The United Nations is about to meet a moment of truth," said Michael Kirby, head of the United Nations Commission of Inquiry. He continues, "The essential question will be whether the United Nations will stay the course and adhere to making the principle of accountability of great crimes a reality." I recently spoke with Joanna Hosaniak, Deputy Director General of the Citizens Alliance for North Korean Human Rights, about North Korea's response to the report.
Well, I would say that they would omit everything that was, very important. I wouldn't call it even human rights report. It's somehow advertisement of the unique political ideological system. So the fact that they tried to create something like that. Well, I don't know. Some people feel that this is important step. For me, it's funny. I mean, they have been preparing human rights report before because when you look into, for example, universal periodic review process that they went through both this year and 4 years ago, they always have to create this kind of human rights report. And if you look at them, they are much more in detail than this human rights report that they publish separately. But they are also very rosy. For example, I can tell you that recently they stated that they admit that they have problems with medical assistance in the province, but because they have state-of-the-art internet connections and technological development, the medical personnel in Pyongyang can assist through internet the surgeries with the doctors in provinces, and you just cannot laugh knowing that there is only 2 hours of electricity in the state, and sometimes people die on the surgical table because they were during the surgery when the cut off happened. So they do put sometimes this bizarre information into their reports, but somehow this is sometimes very irrelevant. Like, for example, they are bragging about, I don't know, making a ski resort and how it improves, the life of the people. I wouldn't, look into that as something very much important. The only thing that matters here, why they did it, is that they did it in order to step up contra, campaign against the report of Commission of Inquiry. And I think we have to look at this as such. This was just a first step to kind of, create this whole charm offensive that they are using right now. And there was a report just a few hours ago that they met with special rapporteur and then that invited them into the country. So this is just another step that they are trying to dismiss the Commission of Inquiry report, and also to try to convince as many countries, especially in the global south, not to vote for the resolution of human rights, especially that will have the clause of the referral to International Criminal Court. So it has nothing really to do with the human rights situation. It's not really substantial report. It has to do with the strategy of how to abolish these efforts that have started with the Commission of Inquiry, and how to stop this process.
You'll be able to hear the rest of that conversation coming up on the November 5th edition of the Asia Now podcast. Earlier this week on Wednesday, North Korea cited the South's continued inability to halt the launching of propaganda leaflets, which Seoul says it has no legal basis to do, as the reason for canceling high-level talks this week. It was hoped that the trip by high-ranking officials during the closing ceremonies of the Incheon Asian Games would bring back a resumption of the dialogues, but that appears not to be the case. South Korean Defense Minister Han Min-koo told lawmakers North Korea's capability to miniaturize a nuclear weapon appears to have reached a significant level. He said he believes Pyongyang is capable of building a uranium-based nuclear weapon. South Korean military and intelligence authorities believe that since 2010, the North has acquired up to 40 kilograms of highly enriched uranium per year, a sufficient amount to build up to 2 nuclear weapons. His comments echo a statement by the United States military commander in South Korea, General Curtis Scarpotti. Quote, "I believe they have the capability to have miniaturized the device at this point, and they have the technology to potentially actually deliver what they say they have." End quote. It's possible this led to the decision announced last week to delay indefinitely the transfer of operational command of South Korean troops. Since the 1950s, the United States has held wartime authority over the South Korean military. A transfer of authority had been scheduled for 2015, something many wanted, but South Korean President Park Geun-hye decided against it. Secretary of State Chuck Hagel said, quote, "While this agreement will delay the transfer of operational control, it will ensure that when a transfer does occur, Korean forces will have necessary capabilities to address an intensifying North Korean threat." End quote. In short, it sounds as if the South Korean military isn't ready to face North Korea without the leadership of the United States. And this leads to a bigger question. It's been more than 60 years since the fighting has ended in the Korean War. Why isn't the South Korean military ready to stand on its own 2 feet? Coming up, the latest financial news in Asia. Late Monday, South Korean prosecutors called for the death penalty in the trial against Lee Jun-suk, captain of the ill-fated Sewol that sunk in April, killing more than 300, many of whom were high school students. They cited his negligence and failure to rescue passengers as grounds. Prosecutors also requested life sentences for 3 other key crew members also on trial for the same charge. Prison terms ranging from 15 to 30 years were requested for the 11 others on trial. Quote, "The captain made no rescue efforts after issuing a broadcast asking passengers to stay in their cabins. He didn't organize rescue operations after leaving the ship, prosecutors said. The death penalty is the maximum legal sentence in South Korea, but there's a de facto moratorium on capital punishment, and the nation has not executed anyone since December of 1997. It is still common, however, for South Korean courts to occasionally issue death sentences. It's most likely the call for the death penalty is an attempt for the prosecution team to appear tough on E in the pursuit of justice. If the death penalty was issued, it would present the government with a new problem. As previously mentioned, no one's been executed since 1997. Failing to carry out the sentence, in this case, would cause a public uproar and make it appear as if the government was going back on its word, something it simply cannot afford to do in the current political climate. Keeping in mind that E is 69 years old, issuing a death sentence to someone of that age might appear inhumane. Sentencing the captain to life in prison is still harsh, and given E's age, is essentially a death sentence, and that could give the court the out it needs. A verdict in this case is expected in November, but this does bring about a good question. In a case such as this, where one individual might be responsible for the death of over 300 people, is capital punishment warranted? I hope you'll share your thoughts in the comments. What else is happening in the Asia-Pacific region? Well, coming up, the weekly brief with stories you may have missed. In the film Jerry Maguire, Tom Cruise danced around shouting, "Show me the money." Well, it's time in this week's podcast to turn our attention to that subject with a few business stories. China and 21 other countries have agreed to start an international development bank to fund infrastructure projects throughout Asia. Dubbed the Asian Infrastructure Investment Bank, or the AIIB, it boasts members from Myanmar, Vietnam, Laos, Cambodia, Vietnam, the Philippines, India, Pakistan, Bangladesh, and Nepal. China's Foreign Ministry spokesperson Hua Chunying said finance ministers of the membership are looking forward to how the AIIB can improve their countries. The United States criticized the bank's formation. Spokeswoman Jen Psaki has said Secretary of State John Kerry made it clear to China that the U.S. welcomes the idea of an infrastructure bank in Asia, but strongly urges that it meet international standards of governance and transparency. She said the United States has concerns about the ambiguous nature of the AIIB proposal as it currently stands. Another concern is how it might affect the World Bank and the Asian Development Bank. Also, some say it would allow China to have undue influence in Asia, as it will be the largest shareholder with a 50% stake in the organization. The International Monetary Fund shared concern over Singapore's plan to slow the number of incoming foreign workers. It warned the decision could moderate potential growth and lower competitiveness, and a shortage of labor would increase wages, forcing businesses to pass on these added costs in the form of higher prices. The IMF also stated that in the long run, the policy could set the stage for a new era of sustainable growth, but it would take a great deal of effort to realize that, given how much the economy would need to offset the loss of cheap foreign labor. Regardless, Singapore was named the second most competitive economy in the world by the World Economic Forum for the fourth year in a row. The Shanghai-Hong Kong Stock Connect program, which was set to start on Monday of this week, has been indefinitely delayed. Speculation is that the protests are responsible, although Hong Kong Exchanges and Clearing Limited Chief Executive Charles Lee said the program hadn't received regulatory approval as of yet. Some sources say it's unlikely the program will take place this year. Lee said the Shanghai-Hong Kong Stock Connect is important for the capital markets of Hong Kong and Shanghai and the internationalization of China's currency. He predicted its implementation would have a significant impact on Hong Kong's development over the next 10 to 20 years. When pressed on the Occupy movement, Lee noted that currently markets are stable, but if the protests continue, the sector could be affected. Don't miss our other podcast, Asia Now. It's released every Wednesday and features stories and interviews from the Asia-Pacific region. This week on the podcast, I sat down with RAND Corporation's Scott Harold to discuss whether or not Asia is headed towards a new Cold War. What else is taking place in the Asia-Pacific region? Well, let's take a look at the weekly brief. Roaring Currents, the South Korean film depicting the naval victory by Admiral Lee Sun-shin over Japanese forces during the Imjin War, has become the nation's highest-grossing film of all time. Much of its popularity stems from the tugging on the heartstrings of national pride and lingering animosity towards the Japanese occupation. A new film seeks to follow in those footsteps, touching on a more controversial subject: the women used as sex slaves during the Second World War. Spirit's Homecoming stars veteran actress Son Suk and a cast of Korean Japanese and Japanese actors. It began filming late last week after being stalled for more than 10 years and was finally moved forward after Son agreed to star in the film. Most of the actors and crew are participating without being on salary. However, noticeably absent in commentary about this particular story was the South Korean government's own sex slave system. And earlier this year, 122 South Korean women sued their own government, seeking an apology and compensation. You can get the full details of that story from our July 11th episode. In a related story, Japanese Prime Minister Shinzo Abe expressed no desire to revise a past government apology for Tokyo's sexual enslavement of Korean women. South Korean government officials hope this indicates Japan's continued efforts to improve their strained relationship. South Korea's National Assembly Speaker Chung Wi-hwa met with Abe at the Prime Minister's office. He said Prime Minister Abe repeated the exact words he said in March. He said he would completely inherit the historical perception of past governments. It may prove to be an unpopular move at home, as some Japanese lawmakers have called to revise or rebuke the Kono Statement. China is considering removing 9 crimes from its list of offenses punishable by death. Currently, 55 criminal activities are eligible for the death penalty, but a draft resolution put to the National People's Congress could reduce that number. Crimes that would be exempt from the death penalty under the proposed guidelines include smuggling weapons, ammunition, or nuclear materials, counterfeiting money, and raising funds by illegal means. Human rights groups say China executes more people than the rest of the world combined. Interesting details have emerged from the pathology reports of the 56 hikers killed in Japan when Mount Ontake erupted. Most appeared to have died instantly after being struck in the head by falling debris. According to the released information, many were apparently taking pictures of the eruption when they perished. A physician interviewed noted that at least one camera had been recovered, with photos taken immediately following the volcano's blast. Penang, Malaysia Chief Minister Lim Guan Eng is causing a stir by supporting a measure barring foreigners from being the main cooks at street food stalls. Quote, "How can this ruling be undemocratic or discriminatory when it is intended to protect the uniqueness of Penang food, that hawker stalls must be owner-operated, and that foreign workers can assist the hawker in other duties?" He made the comment in response to criticism directed at his administration. Lim argued that incompetent foreign workers are serving lousy food that could damage the image of hawker food, which is one of the main attractions of Penang. Quote, "Unlike other cities, tourists come to Penang for food, and the state government is not going to risk our tourism industry by allowing indifferent foreign workers to jeopardize the branding of delicious Penang street food." End quote. And finally, Indonesian President Joko Widodo unveiled his much-anticipated cabinet to mixed reviews. Of note, Retno Lestari Marsudi was chosen to be the first female foreign minister of Indonesia. The remainder of the cabinet, which Widodo is calling a working cabinet, is a mix of professionals and party officials, disappointing many who had urged him to shun straight political appointments. Those are all the stories for this week's podcast. And since our last podcast, by far the most amount of discussion on the web has surrounded our Asia Now report on Tatsuya Kato, the Japanese reporter who had been indicted on defamation charges in South Korea. What was great about this story was the degree of which there was active engagement in the comments from nearly all points of view. Scott Ackerman had this to say: "It was definitely a shutdown on freedom of speech and an attack on the reporter and the institute he represents. I personally have no love for a lot of right-wing politics here in Japan due to the fact that most extreme forums want me out of the country. But the attack that has been launched against this reporter, while his South Korean peers reporting the same go untouched, is undeniably based on personal vendetta and provocation." King of Pop shared a different opinion. "I don't think it's a free speech issue. We all know the Senkai News Media is a well-known right-wing news agency, and most of their journalism is aimed at degrading the image of Korea and Koreans. They can do that in Japan, and it's protected under free speech. But their journalism isn't free speech. It's more like hate speech aimed at Koreans. Senkai should have been kicked out of Korea 20 years ago." When I pointed out that the same information had been printed in numerous Korean publications, Song Villaru said, "That's because the Chosun Ilbo, Yonhap, and other Korean newspapers have not repeatedly caused damage to the Korean government in the past, and was given the benefit of the doubt. Senkai is a different story. This time, they have crossed the line, especially when the subject relates to 300-plus casualties. Senkai exists to provide a chuckle or a laugh to the Japanese audience, and they chose a very tragic accident as the source of their laugh this time." William Cho correctly identified the complexity of the issue, breaking it down into its components. Number 1. What is the most accurate translation of the Japanese language article? Number 2. What is defamation? Number 3. What is defamation as it is defined by Korean law? And number 4. Was that interpretation applied fairly to Kato and his Korean peers? Those specific comments were heavily debated in the comments of the podcast over on the Japan Today website and are well worth a read, since many took the time to carefully examine the Japanese language article itself. And again, everyone who left comments on all of the podcasts since our last episode, I want to thank you so much. I truly do value them, and I hope you'll take a moment to share your thoughts about this week's stories. You can leave them in the comments, you can leave them on Facebook, or you can share them via Twitter. If you haven't found us on social media, you can find us at facebook.com/Asian News Weekly or at Asian News Weekly on Twitter. You can also send an email to the show with your question, feedback, or audio comments. Just drop a line to asiannewsweekly@gmail.com. You can play and download every single one of our episodes at our website, asiannewsweekly.net. But if you prefer the show in podcast form, you'll be able to find us on iTunes, Stitcher, and TuneIn Radio. And if you really enjoyed this episode, please share it with your friends and subscribe so you won't miss the next one. For more news, check out the Asia Brief podcast. It's released every Monday through Thursday morning with the region's key stories. Well, my friends, that is it for this week's episode. I'd like to thank you for listening, and until next time, for Asia News Weekly, I'm Steve Miller. Asia News Weekly is licensed under a Creative Commons Attribution 4.0 international license.